Reed Pruitt came to my door at first light wanting a wedding by Friday, and he hadn't yet picked the bride. I'd baptized that man, buried his mother, and watched him grow into someone who didn't waste a single word he hadn't already weighed twice, so I didn't laugh, though I confess I wanted to. His father's will gave him until his 30th birthday to take a wife, or the East Range, and the spring at Cobble Creek went to his cousin Cyrus, who'd have the water sold off and the grass grazed to dust inside a year. Reed had 11 days left and not one prospect. I already knew the woman he was about to name, as it happened, though not from him. Judge Pratt had stopped me on the courthouse steps 2 weeks prior, troubled in a way that Judge rarely allowed himself to look. Bertie Calder's parents had died of the same fever inside 10 days of each other that spring, leaving her the bakery, a stack of unpaid notes, and a 10-year-old brother with no other kin in the territory to claim him. The law required a settled household for a guardian to keep a child past a certain age without one. 30 days, the judge had given her, and 20 of them were already spent. She'd sold the last of her mother's good dishes to keep current on the bakery's note and hadn't told a soul, except the judge had a way of finding things out. "There's a woman keeps the bakery on Pine Street," Reed said, his hat turning in both hands like a man confessing something. "Bertie Calder. Judge Pratt's given her 30 days to show a settled household, or her brother goes to the territorial home in Laramie. I figure to solve 2 troubles with 1 ceremony, Reverend, if she'll have me." I asked him if he loved her. "Spoken to her twice," he said. "Once to buy bread. Once to ask would she marry a stranger to keep her brother out of an orphan's home. She didn't cry and she didn't faint. Asked what was in it for me, plain as you please, and didn't flinch when I told her. I respect a woman who puts the hard question first. I looked at 2 other women in this county before her, a banker's widow and a schoolteacher's sister, and both wanted promises I wasn't fixing to make. Bertie Calder wanted a contract. I can keep a contract. So I married them on a Tuesday in my own front room. No flowers, no singing. Bertie had sold every loaf in her case that morning rather than close the shop on her own wedding day, and she came to me still smelling faintly of yeast and wood smoke, chin up, hand steady in his. Her brother Eli stood close enough to touch her skirt, watching Reed with the wary, measuring look of a boy who has already lost more than his share and means to keep careful count from here on. Reed said his vows like a man reading a deed. She said hers the same. Neither one looked at the other a second longer than the words required. When I pronounced them man and wife, Reed shook my hand, paid me for my trouble, and the 3 of them rode out to 5 Oaks Ranch before the dust in the road had even settled. I thought that was the whole of the story. I was wrong, and I had a front row seat to being wrong. The foreman at 5 Oaks, a sun-cracked old hand named Otis, came by the parsonage that first week for a different matter entirely and let slip, shaking his head, that the new Mrs. Pruitt had taken the small back bedroom without being asked and Reed hadn't said a word against it, that they passed the salt at supper like 2 strangers boarding at the same hotel, that the boy ate fast and said little and watched the door. Asked her last night did she want the wash done before or after the noon meal, Otis told me, and she asked him did it matter to him either way, and he said it didn't, and that was the whole conversation. Civil as church, and about as warm. I didn't think much of it at the time. A contract is a contract, and most of them start that cold. What changed it, Otis always swore, was the ledger. Reed had kept his own books since his father died, badly, by his own admission, and one wet evening in September Bertie sat down at his kitchen table uninvited, pulled the ledger toward her, and started correcting 2 years of his arithmetic without asking permission. She'd run the bakery's accounts alone since she was 19 and could carry a column of figures in her head faster than most men could find a pencil. Reed stood in the doorway and watched her work for the better part of an hour before he said a single word, and the word he said was, "Thank you," which Otis claimed was the first time he'd heard that rancher thank anybody for anything since the funeral. After that she kept his books on Thursdays, and the kitchen table stopped being a place where 2 strangers passed the salt. It was Eli who showed me the next crack in it, the way children show you everything without meaning to. He came by the parsonage that October for his letters lesson. I'd kept up his schooling since the move, and announced, unprompted, that Mr. Pruitt had let him name the spotted calf and had given him their granddad's jackknife to carry, not to keep, but he said I could carry it like it was mine. "That's a fine thing," I said. "He don't talk much," Eli said, working his letters slow. "But he showed me how to set a fence post so it don't lean. Took the whole afternoon. Said a job worth doing took the time it took. A man who'll spend an October afternoon teaching a boy that isn't his blood how to set a fence post is not a man who solved two troubles with one ceremony and called it finished. He's a man who started keeping a family, whether he meant to or not. I heard the rest from Bertie herself. The Sunday she came about hymnals for the children's social, she'd kept running the bake sale same as always, married or not being a woman to let a ring change who she'd already decided to be. She told me, not quite meeting my eye, that Reed had ridden 2 hours to town and back in a hard rain because the bakery's flue had cracked, and she hadn't said one word about it. He'd simply noticed, on his one trip to town that week, that her smoke was running wrong, and fixed it himself before supper without being asked, soaked through, and refused the coffee she tried to press on him afterward, saying only that he had to get back before dark. "That's not in any contract I signed," she said. "No," I agreed. "It isn't." She didn't say more, but she didn't need to. I'd married enough frontier folk to know the particular quiet that comes over a person who started hoping for something they didn't order and can't send back. By the Christmas social I'd watched it ripen from a dozen pews and porches. Reed rode the long way into town most weeks so he'd pass the bakery window. Bertie packed him a second supper most days, in case the foreman forgets to feed him, though Reed Pruitt had never once forgotten a meal in his life. At the social itself, in front of half the county, he danced with her exactly once, stiff as a fence post, and she laughed at something he said low enough that nobody else caught it, and Otis nudged me in the ribs and said he hadn't heard that woman laugh free like that since the spring her parents died. Eli still called him nothing fancier than Reed, but he'd taken to following him everywhere a boy is allowed to follow a man, and once, that February, when Reed took a kick from a green colt and went down hard in the corral dust, the boy ran to him faster than I ever saw him run to anyone, white-faced, before Reed had even finished cussing the horse. Reed sat up holding his ribs, looked at that boy's face, and went quiet in a way I only saw once more after that, and that time was worse, and better. Cyrus Pruitt was not a man to lose land gracefully. Reed's only cousin, and the only kin who'd ever begrudged him the ranch, Cyrus had watched the wedding from the back of my front room with his arms crossed and his jaw set, and by January he'd convinced himself, or convinced a lawyer in Cheyenne to convince Judge Pratt, that a marriage contracted in 11 days, to a woman Reed had spoken to exactly twice, was no marriage at all, but a fraud worked against his uncle's will. He filed to have it set aside, and the county turned out to watch. The hearing was held in the schoolhouse, every bench full, because there is no better entertainment on the frontier than two cousins fighting over land in front of a judge. Cyrus's lawyer was smooth and quick, and he laid the marriage out exactly as cold as it had looked that Tuesday in my front room. A deed disguised as a vow, he told the judge, pacing in front of the stove. A business arrangement dressed up in a church dress to satisfy a dead man's clause, entered into in 11 days between a man and a woman who'd traded perhaps a dozen sentences total. I asked the court to look past the ceremony to the arithmetic underneath it. I watched Bertie's spine go straight and her chin come up the same way it had the day she married a stranger to keep her brother. Judge Pratt, who did not care to have his courtroom used as theater, asked Reed plainly whether the marriage had been entered into for love or for land. Reed stood. I'd never once seen him reach for words, he generally kept them ready, the way a careful man keeps his tools oiled. This time he was quiet long enough that Cyrus's lawyer started to smile. "Judge, I married Bertie Calder for the ranch," Reed said. "I won't stand here and lie about it. I had 11 days and a deadline, and she had a brother and a debt, and we made each other a fair trade. I'd do it again the same way if I had to live those 11 days over." He stopped, looked once at Bertie, and something in his face came loose that I don't believe he'd let loose since his mother's funeral. "But I'm not standing here today for the ranch. I lost track somewhere this winter of caring whether I kept it. I'd hand Cyrus every acre in the water besides before I'd hand him one more excuse to take that woman and that boy out of my house. That's not written in any will. That's just true." The schoolhouse went the kind of quiet that has weight to it. Bertie stood up next to him without being asked, which I think surprised Reed more than it surprised the judge. "I married him to keep my brother," she said, "and I want the court to know I'd marry him again tomorrow for an entirely different reason. Nobody asked me that. I'm telling you anyway, because I get a say in my own life same as he does." Eli, 10 years old and apparently done sitting still, climbed off the bench and walked straight to Reed and took his hand in front of the whole county, which settled the matter better than any lawyer could have. Judge Pratt dismissed Cyrus's petition inside of 5 minutes and told him, not unkindly, to go on home and tend his own fences. Cyrus left by the back door before the room had finished talking about it, and nobody much noticed him go. I married Reed and Bertie again that April, on a Sunday after church, with the orchard behind the parsonage just coming into blossom. Not because the law required it, nobody asked that of them, but because Reed asked me to, quietly, with nobody present but Bertie and Eli and old Tom Halverson, who happened to be sweeping the steps and stayed to watch. Reed had a ring this time, his mother's, small and plain and gold worn at the band, that he'd been carrying folded in a handkerchief in his coat pocket since January, waiting for a moment that felt earned instead of owed. He said his vows slower the second time through. He looked at her the whole way, and she looked back, and neither one of them was reading a deed. I've stood up front for a great many weddings in this county, some for love, plenty for plain frontier necessity, a contract signed because the winter was coming and a body can't run a ranch or a bakery alone. I'd never before watched one turn, midstream, from the second kind into the first, the way water finds its way downhill without anybody planning the route. Reed Pruitt set out to solve two troubles with one ceremony. He ended up solving the one trouble he never knew he had, a closed-up heart, waiting 11 days and a long hard winter for somebody worth opening it for.